here in the DC metro area. And my name is Chris Lewis. I'm the President and CEO of Public Knowledge, and I'd like to welcome folks as we're letting our attendees into the webinar. Want to welcome folks to our very first free expression forum here at Public Knowledge. Glad to have you all. Hope all of you who are joining us on Zoom and also live on YouTube will enjoy this hour and enjoy this series that we are kicking off here. This should be an interesting series, wide-ranging topics, and all with the goal of talking about the value and the importance of free expression online. This is core to Public Knowledge's mission and the work that we work on. Our mission starts with promoting free expression online. And so with this free expression forum series that we'll be having monthly, we want to have an ongoing dialogue about the importance of free expression online to artists and entrepreneurs and content creators, all the folks who use the internet and value how the internet has made it easier for everyone to have a low barrier to speak and the ability to create, and organize, and speak online. So welcome. We also are going to use this series over time, hopefully to highlight how policy impacts free expression. We want to talk about how diverse voices online are impacted by those policies, and to make sure that we connect community members of online creators to how they can stand up and get involved with the policy process to make sure that free expression is preserved online. It's perfectly organized and timed that we are starting this at 2:30 here Eastern time, because our first topic for our first free expression forum is about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And so for the next hour, I'll be talking with a wonderful panel of policy experts who've joined us to talk about how free expression is promoted by 230, what Section 230 is, and some of the policy debates going on are right around Washington and around the country on what should happen with Section 230 to either promote or preserve free expression. Let me introduce my my guests, our wonderful panelists who are joining us. I'm joined by, from the Public Knowledge team, Policy Counsel Bert Lee, who Bert is one of our lead thinkers and writers on Section 230, so glad he could join us. Also joined by Daiquiri Ryan. Daiquiri is a strategic legal advisor and policy counsel at the National Hispanic Media Coalition. She's also the founder of Neticolab, which is her boutique side project, which Daiquiri, you can tell us about if you want to. But she wears multiple hats these days. And then lastly, we're joined by Professor of Law at Howard University, Professor Lateef Mtima, for my money, the godfather of intellectual property and social justice, and as well an expert on Section 230. So thank you all, the three of you, for joining us today. And what we'll do is we'll jump right into this topic and have an open conversation, but we want our attendees to know that this is meant to be interactive. So if you're joining us on Zoom, you can use the Q&A function to pose questions for our experts. And so please feel free to do that throughout the hour, and we'll try and turn to those as we go along and answer your questions as much as possible. And then in the end, we'll have a quick interactive survey for you as well that we hope you can take and help us make these ongoing free expression forums as responsive to the needs and the interests of you guys, our audience, as possible. So with that, I'm going to turn to our amazing panel, and maybe I can start with Bert. Bert, since you've been writing so much and we have an ongoing series at Public Knowledge on Section 230 on our blog, Bert, maybe you can give us just the outlines of what Section 230 is and what it does. What is it meant to do and protect?
Well, First and foremost, thank you so much, Chris, and thank you so much to the panelists, particularly Professor Mtima, my former professor at Howard Law, and Daiquiri, who's just absolutely incredible in all the work that she does, and Chris for giving me this opportunity. Secondly, I really want to highlight the fact that Section 230 does a lot of good things in, particularly when it pertains to free expression, because Section 230 basically limits the liability of companies when it engages in content moderation by third parties, right? So what that allows for is that allows platforms and companies to engage in broader scale content moderation as they see fit for their particular platforms. That kind of content moderation is necessary for kind of like a healthy internet, right? Because in the early days of the internet, what we were all concerned with was kind of like the proliferation of like pornography or of kind of like illicit material or like a lot of negative aspects of society were finding their way online. And so Section 230 was built and designed in order to try and incentivize platforms to be able to moderate content how they saw, but also not be penalized for moderating content in ways that may be in violation or of First Amendment or maybe in other ways protected speech because it is a private platform, but to incentivize the platforms again to kind of like clean up the internet ecosphere. And to a certain degree, it's been successful in a lot of ways, right? But in some ways it hasn't. And so, but like Section 230 at its core does protect free expression by at least allowing platforms to set their own rules and guidelines so that they can better kind of have users interact with their service with a shared understanding of how those users' content will be treated on those platforms.
Great, thank you, Bert. And we provided for our folks live on Zoom a link to Public Knowledge's series, I think the first in our series on Section 230, that gets into some of that legal history and where the law came from. What are we missing there, Daiquiri? You know, when you think of Section 230 and who benefits and who it protects, who do you think of?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it was designed to protect free expression, right? It's designed to kind of make sure that we all have a chance to freely express our opinions and all the things that we'd like to online. But I think in practice today, we actually see it benefiting the platforms more so than the people and the users themselves.
Professor, you know, we do often hear it referred to as a liability shield. People do think of the big platforms like Daiquiri said. How do you think of how folks benefit from this? Is it anyone beyond the platforms? And, oh, Professor, we've got you on mute, sorry. I'll let you control your mute button there, but there we go.
Ah, okay, good. Yeah, I didn't realize I was on. Yeah, see, I think that Section 230 benefits many people in society, and in particular, those who are marginalized, those whose voices are typically not heard. The way I think about Section 230 is that we all understand how the First Amendment protects free speech in the brick and mortar real world. But I think that it is Section 230 that protects free speech on the internet, right? Because think about what the situation would be like without some sort of rules of the road, right? You know, you have this public market space in which people can talk, but without any rules of the road, there are a couple of things that would happen. First of all, what happens if the biggest guy in the village decides to come to the middle of the marketplace and he decides he's going to dominate it? He's going to give long, boring speeches that are an hour long, and he decides he's going to do it for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? Without there being some moderation rule, right? What's going to happen is that those with the most power, those with the biggest pockets, or in the village with the biggest muscles, they're going to be able to effectively silence the speech of those who can't stand up to them. In addition, what happens if, besides the guy with the biggest muscles, What happens if there's the local gossip, right? She starts spreading, falsehoods, right? The local con man, he starts telling people, yeah, I've got some stocks, or if it's the village, I've got some oxen to sell, but nobody knows that these oxen have anthrax, right? Okay. Eventually, what's going to happen? One, the integrity of the marketplace is shot. And then secondly, whoever it is that is providing the marketplace in the first place, right? Well, they're going to be exposed to liability that flows from all of that gossip, from all of that misleading information, all of that false speak. So, and what are they going to have to do? They're either going to have to do one of two things: either shut down, right? Or they're going to have to very restrictively moderate, okay? Not just what people say, but who gets to speak, right? Okay, so in a very interesting way, right? I mean, if I'm worried about liability, I'm going to allow somebody who's only going to say, bland things, somebody who's only going to speak in the traditional voice, right? None of this controversial, minority, LGBTQ. No, we're not going to take a risk on any of that type of stuff, right? And in addition, I'm also only going to take a risk on the people with the biggest pockets, because in case I do get sued, I know they can indemnify me. So at bottom, this is how I get to the conclusion that these are the results that would happen without 230. And so as a result, Section 230 does on the internet what the First Amendment does for society at large.
Okay, so if we didn't have Section 230, Bert, professors laid out how folks who may have minority views or controversial views may not be heard. You said this promotes content moderation. That leads to a lot of controversy when decisions are made about how content is moderated. Some rules can be very harsh, some rules could be very lax, and then lots of platforms operate in different ways. How do we wrestle with that benefit, but also concern that comes with Section 230?
I think one way to think about it is that I think the First Amendment comparison that Professor Mtima is made is a good one, right? But I would also say that, like, the First Amendment is not perfect in a lot of ways, but I think that the ways in which you view speech are incredibly important. But I think one of the things that differentiates the First Amendment is that from kind of Section 230 is that what we're dealing with Section 230 is a bunch of private actors. And it's not necessarily the same public square that was envisioned when we first talked about when the First Amendment was created, and like in the founding of our nation and in the ways that we think about speech. The public square has now turned online, but it's also a chosen square, and you're choosing your audience and you're choosing your followers, and then you are also choosing the platform. And so in those choices, those are private corporations making decisions about what benefits them at some point. And so First Amendment doesn't necessarily fit, but what we can ask, and I think what we must ask of a lot of platforms, is to take equity concerns into account when they're engaging when how they think about rules. And so whether it's no rule in a no rules environment, it's kind of more of what we've been fighting against as like advocates, which is disinformation, scams, whether you're talking about hate speech, right? A lot of those things, like for instance, hate speech, that's constitutionally protected by the First Amendment. If we were to kind of like take away Section 230 and then make a lot of these platforms like public squares, you would see a lot more hate speech because it can't be taken down. And there is a case like that in WMATA, right? In the advertising for WMATA, where it was just like all savages must die when talking about those who are of Muslim faith. And WMATA lost that suit because like it was a public venue, it was a public space, and thus protected by the First Amendment. And we have to keep those things in mind when we're talking about platforms and when we're talking about content moderation, because we don't really want a public square. I think a lot of us think we do, but in reality, we don't. But can the rules and the ways in which we think about the public square be better enforced? Absolutely. And I think that there is no doubt about that. There's no denial of that. I think every major platform will say those same things. But we need 230 in order to do that, because if you're taking down speech, you do not want people to be liable for the takedown of the speech, right? And so that creates a kind of like the harsh rules versus no rules, right? Harsh rules really do benefit the big guys. And I think Professor Mtima did put it in the best way possible. Who it really benefits corporations. And so what you have with really harsh rules is that only corporations are really going to have the back channels with a lot of the major corporations to be able to have speech online in a lot of ways. That's contextualized, and it's still seen kind of now, right? Not a lot of the tweets of major corporations have been taken down, for instance, right? And so what you want to say is that there is a middle ground, but we just don't know how to legislate it right now, and the policy behind it is incredibly difficult. And there are a bunch of ideas that can help us get us there. But like there's going to be this balance of rules, but we have to keep in mind just like the legal landscape of which we are currently in right now. If we want to change that, there are going to be consequences, but specifically as it relates to content moderation, I think there are some real equities that have to be taken into account when we talk about how harsh or how lax the rules are and who really is going to benefit from this.
Daiquiri, you and NHMC definitely have been a part of coalition at the forefront of fighting for moderating hate speech, taking down hate speech, tracking hate speech. Those rules can be viewed to be harsh by some, like Bert was saying, but others view them to be necessary to create a safe space. I mean, can you think of examples where 230 and content moderation have been helpful, and are there concerns you have about its power with large platforms?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm so glad that Professor, you brought up the public square, and Bert, you too, because I think there's another layer of context there, right? We're definitely not in the public square where you're standing on your soapbox, right? Just shouting your opinions to those who walk by. Instead, you're still putting your words out, your opinions out, right? But there's a whole system of algorithms that decides who gets to see your opinions, how many people get to see that post, and how popular that opinion is going to be on the platform. And so if you think about it, it's like the equivalent of some big actor coming and seeing you standing on your soapbox and taking you to a stage in front of thousands of people just because, they decided that that's what was going to happen with your content that day. And so when we think about free expression in this way, I really want to put it kind of in the context of what we see as the reality. And not all content is equal. And the platforms are designed this way to increase use by everyday people and to monetize their popular content. And then, what is popular? What is viral? Sometimes, it's really interesting thought pieces or breaking news or even, art and culture that shifts the way that we think, really awesome things that are put out by creators of color, but it's often hate or white supremacist, extremist, violent, radicalizing content. So when we get into this world where white supremacist content is more prioritized than, say, news or even civil rights content, we're no longer talking about like free speech in the way that we think of it in the public square. This is a design that doesn't necessarily have very much human check on it. And so that, for me, is where the content moderation piece should come in, so that we can ensure that free expression as a concept, as a principle, is available to all users. But I don't think we'd be having this conversation today if the content moderator powers of the world were doing their job.
Okay. So it sounds like, Professor, it gets complicated pretty quickly. I mean, there are a lot of folks, powerful folks, who have criticized content moderation, saying that certain content moderation choices have limited free speech. Do you think that's true?
Well, you see, I really like the way Daiquiri set it up, because I think this gets us to the heart of the current controversy. It separates attacks on just having any 230 mechanism at all from the other issue, which is, okay, how should a Section 230 mechanism work best, right? So some of the current attacks are saying, no, let's do away with 230 altogether. Let's just have, total wild, wild west. Anybody can say anything that they want. That's what free speech is all about. Well, first of all, that's not true. throughout our society, we've always had some legal restrictions on, quote, bad speech. You can't defame people. You can't threaten people. You can't defraud people, right? So that's just not true. But secondly, I think Daiquiri hit upon the real reason, the real motivation behind the position of some actors that are saying, let's do away with all the rules altogether, because this takes us back to the big bully in the square. They know that they are the most powerful. They know that they have the resources and the ear of society, that their voices in a totally no rules world, they know that they will be heard, and minority voices, outsider voices, those will be squelched. So I think that one thing that I hope we can ultimately agree on in our society is that we definitely need a 230 structure. We need that rule. But then this gets to the second issue, which is what both Daiquiri and Bert were talking about. Okay, but now let's not let that mechanism become the new tyrant, right? Let's not, which is one of the really best criticisms of things like, for example, the black box of AI, right? If we don't know what's going on in the artificial intelligence, we have basically ceded authority over to whomever. And it looks like we are protecting free speech, but we have almost like a secret society making decisions, as Daiquiri illustrated, as to, well, who gets to speak and who gets to speak when. So I think that once we get past this notion of those who really are like, well, because we have the most power, we don't want any rules. Once we can get to the point that we say, no, we see through that. We know we need a 230 mechanism, right? Then we get to move on to the things that Daiquiri and Bert are talking about, which are very legitimate. That, okay, but is 230 always doing what it's supposed to do? And are there not some circumstances in which perhaps some voices are being excluded improperly, right? And certainly we can look at those mechanisms and see how best can we refine it to make certain that content moderation is working the way that it ought to work.
So we're having a great theoretical conversation here. I'm curious for each of you, are there examples that you can think of, or any of you, examples you can think of where content moderation was empowered and you may not have agreed with it, or content moderation was empowered and you thought it was important and someone else didn't agree with it? And what do we do in those situations? I'm looking to make this real for folks.
Yeah, so I mean, when you say that, the first thing that comes to mind is this conservative bias thing, right?
I see the finger quotes, Daiquiri.
Right, so there's this
here for folks who are viewing this plan.
Right, there's a few conservative politicians who have attacked the platform saying, you have a conservative bias against us and you're taking down all of this content only from, conservatives, which one is just not true. If you look at the data, it's 100% not true. But there are some pieces of content that happen to be posted by conservative politicians that are taken down. And that's because it's hate speech or it's anti-immigrant or it has slurs. And so that's an instance where absolutely that content should not be on those platforms, particularly from someone who is a public figure, in my opinion. And for sure, the conservative politicians just talk about it every chance they get that they do not agree with that.
Yeah. I think an extension of that point is that the other thing we have to remember is, and it's a point that Bert made earlier, that Section 230 and what it's supposed to do, it's not identical to the First Amendment, right? First Amendment is about saying, hey, we're going to make certain that government does not control what people say, right? 230 simply says, hey, okay, if you invite people into your house to have a conversation, right? You should have some ability to determine, what's said in your house, right? So, it's that, you go home for the family dinner and you want to start, it's Thanksgiving, and you want to start preaching to everybody about the latest political whatever. And, your grand aunt says, you don't bring that up here in my house, right? And grandson cannot stand up and say, what about my First Amendment, right? Okay. First of all, it's a total misconception of the First Amendment because grandma is not the government, right? And then secondly, it's just outright disrespectful. Listen to what grandma has to say. So, so I think that, the point that Daiquiri is making is that, yes, the people who are most complaining that the content moderation mechanism is working improperly, right? When it comes to these types of offensive, and perhaps not outright illegal, but inappropriate, improper, threatening type speech, they're really twisting the First Amendment, right? They're saying, I have a First Amendment right to say awful things. And we're saying, yes, but your First Amendment right to say awful things protects you from the government anywhere, but it does not allow you to say whatever you want to say in my house. Because in my house, I have a responsibility to everyone, right? Everybody's sitting around this table, and I have to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to speak. Everybody has an opportunity to be heard. Everybody has an opportunity to be comfortable and not feel threatened. Is this guy sitting next to me going to club me over the head when I, go to the restroom, right? Okay. It's about proper policing. Again, as has already been noted, we're not necessarily saying that every single time a platform engages in the effort to proper police, that they're always doing it correctly. But we shouldn't be fooled by, for example, white supremacist groups who are trying to get us to believe that they have a First Amendment right to preach hate anywhere, anytime that they please.
Bert, I want to come to you, but I want to push the professor a bit further down where he's been going because, I don't think any of us are in favor of white supremacists or hate speech. But we didn't have these conversations before the internet, Professor. At least not on traditional media.
Right.
What is the recourse, for someone who feels like maybe you're a white supremacist and you feel like you should have the right to speak? What is the recourse for them? What's the recourse for someone who says something controversial that we may agree with, but they've been taken down from a platform, a major platform like a Facebook or a Twitter? Do they have any recourse? What are the options here that are available to them on the internet that weren't available when there were just TV stations or radio stations?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the big difference was that you're right, in a very interesting way. We would not have had these conversations before the internet because you only had, in the days when I was growing up, 3 networks, and they made all the decisions, right? Yeah, so they could exclude the white supremacist, the civil rights speaker, the gay activist, everybody, okay? So the quality of the public discourse was extremely limited, right? So you've hit upon a very positive evolution. With great democracy comes complex problems, right? Be careful what we ask for. So we ask for a greater opportunity for public discourse. And that means, well, now we got these complicated choices that we have to make. But that's a good thing, right? With respect to anyone who feels that, hey, you have taken down my speech in your private house, but for bad reasons, right? For reasons of political animus or racial animus or what have you. Yeah, those people, their recourse should be to be able to at least point that out, to demonstrate that you aren't really using the 230 mechanism the way that you're supposed to do, to make certain that we all have a safe and, equal opportunity environment. No, you have some sort of hidden agenda. But I think what Daiquiri pointed out is that if you look at the data, the people who are saying that the most, well, the facts just don't back them up.
Right. Okay. There's a lot there. We can talk about the data and the controversy about conservative bias. If folks want us to, remember, you can ask us questions. We've reached past the halfway point. So if you do have questions, please throw them into the Q&A and we'll try to address them. Bert, I saw you making a face. I told you I was going to come to you. Correct us if we're wrong. Because I said, oh, we weren't having these conversations before, and you made a face. I know you've written a lot about equity and moderation. I want to talk about that, but also tell me what you were thinking.
No, I was thinking that the 1988 David Duke presidential campaign is informative on a litany of levels, not only currently based off of who's running for president, or who ran for president in 2016, or who may be president. But like there are a bunch of comparisons there, because like, what is a platform in and of itself, right? It's a platform to be able to speak and talk about your ideas. And so like, how do you couch those things? Are those things socially acceptable, right? And I think that that's an important context to have when we're talking about Section 230, because, Daiquiri and accurately pointed out that like conservative bias is not a thing, but bias against the speech of those who are Black and those who are LGBTQ plus and those who are Latin and speak Spanglish, that is happening on the platforms right now, particularly Facebook. And so Michelle, who's helping run the webinar, she was so kind to drop the piece that I wrote, Moderating Race on Platforms, where it highlights what happened with Ryan Williams, right? Ryan Williams is from Gaithersburg, and he had an incident where a neighbor called him a racial slur and then called the police on him and alleged that he was assaulted. And he wrote this Medium post about the incident, calling out the man by name, right? Saying that this man, this neighbor did something to me and I felt some type of way, but it was in the context of forgiveness and it was on Medium, which is supposed to be just a general kind of like blog sphere where you can put out any sort of idea, like what ostensibly we're trying to protect within the context of the platform. Medium took that post down. They said it was harassing and they really haven't given a lot of context to it. And then there was a Washington Post article about it. I write about this within the context of platforms on the piece, and like, I won't go deep into it, but I think that that's super important because it's never within the context of who gets to speak where, when, and how. That has never been equal within American history, right? If we want to take it out of the context of race and just put it in the context of gender, that conversation is very real and very pertinent right now, because a lot of women are deplatformed or harassed online because of actions by men targeting them. And I think Daiquiri can speak much more intelligently to that than I can. I would like to cede the floor to her on that point. But before then, I'd just like to kind of highlight that there are certain aspects of platform and the content moderation that we do have to pay attention to. Like, platforms do have to be conscious of. They do have to be conscious of how they treat marginalized groups and their content, because one, they disproportionately use social media. And they disproportionately fuel the content machine that helps get them advertising dollars and ultimately helps build their stock portfolio. But also at the same time, unless you have those people in there and unless you can have those conversations about what is acceptable and what is not, how do we have these kinds of conversations on an integrated level, or even how to tell between satire and actual like targeting, right? Until you have those people in there having those conversations, the content moderation becomes incredibly difficult, because I'm not a member of the LGBTQ plus community. I can't moderate their content. I don't know those kinds of conversations. I don't know the coded language. And to be honest, I shouldn't be having to. And so we should actually ask the platforms, in order to kind of make them better, to engage more of the community inside of their content moderation practices so we can make it better. Because ultimately, a more diverse set of ideas and beliefs and a better kind of content moderation regime, both from a platform perspective and from a social perspective, is better for everyone. Because then you're limiting the stuff that is targeting, harassing, bullying, viral for all of the wrong reasons. And then you're uplifting really interesting conversations and jokes. And sometimes the jokes can go too far. Shout out to Black Twitter on that. But like, I think there is a lot of space in between those, there's a lot of space in between to play. And that space is actually pretty safe. And that's the space that we've liked for an extended period of time as people when we have these kind of intellectual, high-minded conversations. That is the kind of conversation that I wish was happening on more platforms. But that is the kind of conversation that Section 230 wants to facilitate. But extending that out and making sure that the voices of marginalized communities is heard consistently, that is something that like my piece tried to do and like tried to highlight, and how difficult that is, and how that ends up being a disparate impact to marginalized communities because these people were not built in mind. The coding was not with them in mind, but not with the language in mind, and not with the culture in mind.
So before I turn to a couple of these questions coming in from the audience, and please keep them coming, audience. Let me challenge the group, because we got a group of 4 people of color here talking about bias. I think we have a lot of agreement on what we would like to see when it comes to moderation. But maybe someone else out there, they hear elected officials saying things like that these platforms should be neutral, that when their stuff is taken down, that shows bias against them. Should platforms be neutral? Is there any neutrality in moderation, or is moderation inherently about having a bias? Maybe it's a bias against misinformation, but some sort of bias. Am I wrong?
I'm so glad you raised that point, because it takes off wonderfully from the point that Bert was making, right, about coded speech. When you hear that from those sectors, that, well, it should be neutral, neutral is code for white majority, right? I mean, as you and I have discussed before, like one of my favorite phrases that I use in talking about social justice in the IP sphere, the IT sphere, is that, the rules are the rules until I lose, right? In other words, hey, when things were fair and proper, those of us in white majority culture, we always were on top. Our views were not challenged. Our views were predominant, right? If we now are in a system in which our views are sometimes challenged, right? I'm a white male, and what I'm saying is not completely accepted and sometimes corrected. Obviously, the rules are now unfair, right? Per se, right? And that's what we have to recognize. That's why this point about having, quote, others in the room, it helps to take a system that we had always been duped to thinking was neutral, right? And those of us outside of the system always knew, don't look quite neutral to me. It helps to, by bringing others into the room, right, making it more inclusive, we are moving this system to the middle. We are making it neutral and inclusive. But naturally, if you benefited when it was on that side, you will scream about how unfair it is and how ungreat America has become.
So sorry, Daiquiri, please.
Thanks. I totally agree with you, Professor. And that made me think of this phrase, equity feels like oppression only if you're privileged. And so, I mean, I think that's a wonderful segue into something that I've been thinking about as well, is that even if we had a perfect world, even if the Facebooks of the world did all of the content moderation we wanted to, they took down all of those pieces, our online experiences as people of color, as someone who's marginalized, it's not going to be equitable, because there's never a world where you can take an inequitable and unjust society and just put them online and that you'll have equity. It just doesn't work that way, especially when, and this is going back to what I was saying earlier, right? Especially when these systems are built, these algorithms are built, all of the code, everyone who's in a power position or decision maker, they don't look like us. They never look like us. So they're not thinking about us, we're afterthoughts, and it's for sure not designed for us to thrive in.
One of the folks in the audience talks about the concern of conservative bias here, and says, why isn't there why isn't the availability of competitive options to the big platforms like a Facebook or Twitter more in the discussion around Section 230? So we're looking at competition and alternatives to these dominant platforms. Parler exists, they say, and I don't know Parler. It's not one of the big major platforms, but apparently there's a platform out there called Parler that advertises itself as a haven for free speech. And so, why or should we encourage folks who are concerned about conservative bias or their speech being moderated, encourage them to use other platforms, competitive platforms? Isn't that what the free market's all about? So there's a lot there in that comment. Curious how folks respond to that.
So I want to jump on this because I actually think this is healthy and really important to think about within the context of the internet. So when I was younger, my first experience on social media was MySpace, Black Planet, and oh my gosh, an OK Player.
You're showing your age.
Look, real hip hop. But I think that but those are instructive in a lot of ways, and those platforms are instructive because they're going to moderate content vastly differently. Those boards or message boards were moderated very differently depending on the subject, depending on who was talking, what was flagged, so on and so forth. And that was a space built. A lot of those spaces were built, not necessarily MySpace, but particularly Black Planet and particularly OK Player. Those were spaces built for and by Black people. And of course, they're going to moderate their content differently than the Gab or 8chan, right? And I want to answer this and also answer Harold's question inside of this, that you're going to get differential content moderation regimes anyway, because no two people can agree on a piece of content. One of the neat little parlor tricks that I used to see from some of my friends at Facebook was that they would show a controversial piece of content moderation, and then they would say, hey, you have 60 seconds to decide whether this violates this policy. And then they put you in the shoes of the content moderator. And you could get legitimate debate about that. And I get that. And that's a helpful and useful exercise when thinking about these things. But it's also helpful to thinking about what does really diversity or even competition in the marketplace look like, right? And so there are going to be places where competition does impact content moderation in a lot of meaningful ways, because then you have options as a user. If I don't want to deal with certain kinds of things, I should have the option of the user to be able to take my data, take my information, and then move to there with my friends if we all decide that we want to be there, right? And so that's the kind of content moderation and I think competition kind of go together, because it is because the platforms are so big that they're having such a hard time sometimes doing what is content moderation for everyone, because everyone doesn't think about content moderation the same.
Yeah. And I'd like to take that one step further too. And I think we see this argument in a lot of different places, right? Whether it's net neutrality or competition in the broadband marketplace, that, oh, well, it's a free market, so you can just go and start your own. And if you're not happy here, then that's what you should do. And we kind of lose sight of the reality that we live in, the unjust system that we live in. There's a very big gap of access to capital, right? A lot of people can't just go start their own platform, especially if you're talking about the Black Planets of the world. I can tell you, I don't know any platforms that are user-based that are Latinx founded or run, because so few of us are engineers, so few of us are web developers, so few of us are entrepreneurs. Only 6% of Latinx entrepreneurs have access to venture capital funds every year. So, to me, I'm well, that's part of the reason, is because I feel like it's not a realistic solution.
But, I would just quickly add to that I think it all weaves together nicely in that, we need more diversity in the moderation space, but we need more diversity in the platform space. And I, for one, welcome it. I mean, I watched 8 nights of political convention over the last, 2 weeks. And immediately somebody says, wait a minute, each party only had 4 nights. That's the point, right? I watched both, right? I found my experience to be that much richer because I want to hear from both sides. I want to hear from people that I don't agree with, right? And who I sometimes agree with. So yeah, no, I think Harold's question is a good one in the sense that we want to make certain that I don't think any of us are, quote, in favor of censoring conservative speech. That's not what any of us are really talking about. And I think many times conservative speech is sometimes improperly lumped together with things like white supremacy speech, right? So I'm not interested in protecting the right of somebody to threaten someone because they don't like the way that person looks or they don't like who that person worships. On the other hand, if someone wants to just express a legitimate theoretical opinion point of view that just happens to be completely different from mine on that same issue, that's totally fine. And I welcome that person being able to express that because it's completely different from mine, I'm probably going to learn a little something.
Okay. And just two asides, we could do a whole session, and we can, if folks want us to. Again, we'll have surveys where you can tell us what you want to see at future free expression forums. We can talk about competition and what that means for free expression. Competition on platforms, we can do a lot on that. But we just got a taste here. And then just a reminder with that question that came from John, Daiquiri pointed this out earlier, the statistics show, even with these complaints and concerns, that the dominant content, the content being most shared, is conservative content on Facebook. And there's lots of studies out there, and we can always put those forward. One more I want to go to from the audience here before we try to wrap up with a bit of a discussion about the policy debate right now in Washington. I want to make sure we get to that. We've had great theoretical conversation examples, but first from the audience, we had someone also ask, outside of Section 230, for folks who want better content moderation, what tools do we have to hold platforms accountable, to get them to moderate in the way that we want? Daiquiri, I feel like you might be a good place to start with this one.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I know that Bert is a really great expert in the application of civil rights laws here, but I will answer, and then I'll pass it over to him. Mm-hmm. But I think just kind of doubling down on like what the consequences are, and I think just why it matters so much for us to have other tools or for us to strengthen 230. And that's because for our communities, it's often life or death. And that's a lot of times I get pushback. People are like, that's very dramatic. And so, no, it's actually not when you look at it, right? Like a year ago, a white supremacist drove across the state of Texas, murdered 27 people, and he did it in the name of stopping the Mexican invasion. And it's no coincidence where he got that. Facebook allowed over 2,000 political ads to run calling immigration at the US-Mexico border an invasion. And then, even just last week in Kenosha, Wisconsin, right? We saw a direct connection between Facebook allowing certain pages and events calling for the taking up of arms against protesters. Hours later, 2 protesters were shot. So this is not something that is just, lighthearted. Oh, well, I'm just really upset that my speech is being, censored. No, that's not it. It's that these have real life consequences. And so I'll pass it to you, Bert, to talk a little bit more. I know I can see your smirk. You're very excited to talk about your civil rights law application.
Well, I always, talking civil rights is always something that I'm excited to do. But one of the things that I think is really important in your examples, Daiquiri, is that it was paid advertisements that really fueled a lot of that. And that's one of the things that, John Bergmeyer and myself have really championed, specifically with kind of like our ads and 230 proposal, is that one of the things I struggle with as an advocate is that there is a lot of hate speech online, but I don't necessarily think that Congress has the right legislative tools available to it or the right ideas to be able to tackle it. And that's hard for me to say, because like that is something that like is absolutely aghast. And again, I bring up the example of like what the kind of harassment and stalking and like just even threats that just women get online just for existing, let alone when you get into the racial violence aspect of this. And we saw this early in COVID of what happened to our Asian American brothers and sisters on their side, what has happened with Muslims online, what has happened to Latin people in the Latinx community online. It's abhorrent. But the problem is that, again, some of that is protected by the First Amendment. But what isn't protected by the First Amendment is advertising. And so there is a certain space where business activity should be regulated, right? And so regulating this kind of business activity is a way in which to engage in some form of content moderation. Because if that ad is illegal, if that ad is inciting violence, if that ad is like engaging in some sort of illegal activity or some form of voter suppression, if that ad is engaged in something that we have already decided as a nation and as like a group of people that is already against the law, particularly civil rights laws, then that's something that we should be discussing, because then that is something that 230 is not really allowing within the space. But when it pertains to exact content moderation decisions, that becomes a lot more complicated, right? Whether it's a comment under your page, whether it's somebody who's constantly tweeting you, you can block the page, you can mute that person, so on and so forth. You don't have, or getting doxxed is really hard to deal with. And so I think that this is an integrative conversation. So one of the reasons that John and I have leaned more heavily on the advertising proposal is that there are a lot of harms that come from advertising, and a lot of those harms can be fixed. It can be fixed within the context of like what is content neutral, but which is not focused on content, but on conduct. And we like to focus on conduct, because then when you focus on the conduct, it becomes much easier to regulate. And it becomes much easier for Congress to legislate around. And it becomes much easier for people to have a conversation, because what exactly is the conduct that you're talking about? Not necessarily the content, but just the conduct. Is the conduct illegal? Yes or no? We already have statutes. We have a plethora of statutes regulating advertisement. And so like we should be kind of like filling in about like, where can we blend what we've already thought about this stuff, and where can we blend what is happening right now, and where can we kind of like mesh them together in a 230 conversation that allows for free expression online and allows for platforms to moderate the way that they feel, but also be able to bring in some accountability structures inside of there to make people safe and to not allow the kind of abhorrent conduct that we see online as much, especially if it's paid.
So I think there's another flag of something we could talk about, do a whole session on, but thank you for flagging that, Bert. I do want, before we wrap up here, so folks who may not have heard about 230 before or are hearing about it a lot right now, all of a sudden, probably have heard about it in a couple of different instances, either a bill that is purported to limit or eliminate Section 230, and there's different proposals out there in the Congress, or there's the executive order from the president that has resulted in a petition at the FCC to have the FCC vote or have a ruling on how to limit the scope of Section 230. Why the FCC? Because Section 230 lives in the Communications Act. When we say Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, that was an amendment or an addition to the Communications Act when it was updated in 1996. Give you a little history there if you don't know the legal history. So we have all these proposals out here. What do folks, ask the group, what do you think folks need to know about these proposals? And how should they get engaged on them? Because it sounds like there's some tough decisions being made here about content moderation in 230.
So, I mean, I can start by addressing the executive order a bit. You know, in agency, we came out against President Trump's executive order here. You know, for us, it just seems like the FCC really doesn't have the expertise that's necessary or the authority to be able to really enforce Section 230. And, you know, there's a lot more that we can do that's not an executive order because we're angry that Twitter is fact checking our tweets, right? And so that's kind of where
this started, this executive order. The president got fact checked.
Yes. So, you know, we're not going to entertain the tantrums, but more than that, it's unconstitutional.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would second that and say that public knowledge is already as submitted comments as well. We go through, Harold Feld and John Bergmeyer have done what I think are probably some of the best comments I've seen out of PK on a long time. It was a perfect balance between tone and substance and just absolutely excellent. And so I want to shout out to them and give them their flowers on that because it was just so well done. But ultimately, the president can't just reinterpret a statute to be able to say what he wants it to say, and it's currently unconstitutional what he's trying to do with Section 230, and the interpretation of NTIA we think is not there and completely fallacious, and they interpreted a numerous cases completely the wrong way. With that said, one of the things that people can do is, I think you can really kind of like not only just pay attention and support public knowledge, pay attention to the conversation and support public knowledge on these things, but also really reach out to your member and say like, hey, like this is something that we think about on 230. It's just like, we think 230 protects free expression. And that's something that we can set up and do, and then have conversations with your member and your member offices, or reach out to me or myself or anybody on the panel about this, and really like push back against bad legislation as well. Josh Hawley has a bunch of bad legislation on 230. Earn It Act is not necessarily the best on 230 at all. And really push back against those bad pieces of legislation, specifically Earn It Act, as that is trying to eke its way out of the Senate right now.
Professor?
Yeah, I would just say that I would just make 2 points. First, to sort of like reinforce something I was getting at earlier, that for those who are paying attention to this, I think it's important to separate those proposals that are really aimed at eliminating 230 altogether, and those proposals that are really just trying to revise, reshape, and improve it. I think the first set is totally problematic because without any rules of the road, I think we've already discussed how that's going to be bad for everyone. And that the real motivation behind those proposals are, you know, if you're big and you're strong, you would prefer there to be no rules at all, right? So I think we should distinguish between those. And with respect to the second group of proposals, I think that I would pick up on Bert's point that we need to make certain that if you are within those groups whose voices are typically not heard on these issues, that you should reach out to your representatives. You should get involved, because that really is part of the problem. And, you know, to be fair, oftentimes within the, you know, marginalized communities, traditional legacy communities, it can be very difficult to get the leadership to embrace these issues as being a part of the core conversation, the core mission, the core objectives. So, you know, but we don't always have to follow just what the leaders do. There are many people on this call and many people in this space who know that these issues affects what they do, you know, their media influences, their IP entrepreneurs, blah, blah. So don't wait for anybody else, you know. Yes, reach out, get involved in the policy issues and reach out to your representatives, because they need to know, you know, there have been times when I've gone up on the Hill to talk about IP, and 90% of the time, the first response is shock. They were like, no, the civil rights meeting is down the hall. No, this community is interested in this. And the more that they hear from diverse voices, the more that we are likely to have a more balanced conversation as to how 230 might be improved.
Okay, great point. Thank you, Professor. And so we do have a survey that folks on Zoom can take right now. If you're watching on YouTube, it'll be available. It should be available on the PK website on the event page. We'll also email it out with our follow-up email for everyone who participates. But this survey isn't just important for this conversation. This is the first of our free expression forums. And so we want, as I said at the top, we want to create a place where we can talk about the impact of online voice to online voices, the importance of promoting diverse online voices, especially from marginalized communities. And so we want to make sure we're talking about the topics that you want to hear about. And so please take the survey. Let us know, what topics you'd like to hear us talk about, what we might have touched on in this discussion that that we should elaborate on. Maybe you want to hear more about intellectual property from Professor Mtima, the godfather of social justice and intellectual property. I'm going to keep saying that until someone else says it, Professor. Maybe you want to hear more about competition raised up. No problem, no problem. And maybe you want to hear different format. This is just our first stab at this, and we have tremendous friends like Daiquiri and Professor and on staff here with Bert, who are policy experts. But if you'd like to see us do this in a different way, we're open to doing this monthly in a way that helps you connect to the policy conversation in Washington. So please take the survey. We appreciate everyone joining us. Professor Mtima, Daiquiri, Bert, thank you for a wonderful conversation. And hopefully we'll see you next week. If not live and in person, you'll be on watching the next Free Expression Forum at Public Knowledge. So thank you for joining us.